Morning, everyone. Can everyone hear and see me all right? Great, fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us for another webcast. Today we're going through managing sickness absence and we're going to be talking about repetitive short-term and long-term absences. So this is the subject that I advise on regularly. It's something that when I'm supporting HR teams, HR consultants or management teams, that it's something that can become a bit of a sticky subject. So there's lots to get through. We are going to touch on some of the complexities of the subject. So very, very lightly, we're going to touch on some discrimination stuff, but we will be scheduling another webcast to go through disability discrimination in more detail in the coming weeks. So what we're just going to be looking at here is the nature of sickness absence and the processes. So we're going to kick off. We are going to have some polls as we usually do in this session, so there is the opportunity to take part. We will be taking questions at the end and we will be making the materials available after the session as well. So we are going to have my guide on the Employment Rights Bill, which is going to give you some really good concise detail on the bill and what it means and what we think we need to be doing to prepare. And we're also going to have a sickness absence policy as a bit of a bonus available as well. So what are we going through today? Why do we manage sickness absence? We're going to be looking at triggers, welfare meetings, return to work, short-term and long-term absences, the role of occupational health, when it's reasonable to dismiss, and then we're going to touch on discrimination. So first of all, who are we and why are we presenting to you today? So my name's Alyssa, for those of you who haven't met me before or been on any of my webcasts. I am a specialist employment law solicitor and I typically advise businesses, HR teams and HR consultants on employment law risk. And my background has been spent as a tribunal litigator. So there isn't much really that I haven't come across. I created Heroes, which is not only a HR and employment law consultancy, but also a HR platform, and we're going to come across some of the features and how our software can potentially be useful for you if you're in HR or if you are running your own business. So the why. Why do we manage sickness absence? So if people are sick, surely they can't help it, can they? So why is it a situation that we need to be managing? And often what I'll hear from employers or my HR contacts is, well, look, if someone's ill and they're contagious, I'd rather they don't come in because they're going to make the problem worse. So why would we be punishing for them or managing that situation if actually it's better that they're not in the workforce making everybody else poorly? And actually, if I do have them in, they're not going to be productive. So why force them in at all? Or just saying, you know, I'd rather that they just work from home. Now, ultimately, if someone's off with the flu for a couple of days, that might not be something that actually we do need to manage. What we're talking about here is situations where sickness absence starts to become more of an issue and it starts to present issues for the business. So when might it become an issue? So when we've got a situation that's putting pressure on other colleagues, so if you've got someone who's routinely off or off for a long period of time, and we're not using temps, agency workers, or bringing in additional resources, that's potentially going to place pressure on other colleagues to get the work done. Or it could mean that actually the work isn't completed and then we get an impact on delivery for clients or customers. It could mean that when we've got someone off for a long period of time that we get skill fade due to lack of time in work, and when someone comes back that there's a further capability issue. It could mean that we've got a block on our ability to recruit into a role. It could be an expense of relying on temps or use of overtime. If we've got people off for a long period of time, then they are going to be accruing significant holiday allowances, and also potentially they're retaining company property that could be required by the business. So we've got a poll up on the screen to ask your opinion on this. So what's the biggest challenge that you face in managing sickness absence within your organisation? Is it high frequency of short-term absences, long-term absences that then affect productivity, difficulty in fair and consistent policy enforcement, or lack of communication between HR and managers? So definitely not the bottom one here, but we are seeing a bit of a split there between the top three. So when do we actually start to manage the issue? So my view on this is generally that we should manage all absences. Now, this may sound like it conflicts with what I said on that earlier slide about when we've got someone who's off sick and we don't actually want them in the workplace. If we take the view that when someone is off, that the situation simply gets ignored, then we can sometimes end up in a situation or a culture where somebody thinks, well, if I'm going to be off, so say if I've had a bit of a heavy weekend and decide I'm a bit too hungover on Monday to come into work, nothing's going to be done about it. Nobody's really going to notice, and nothing bad's going to happen. It's more likely then to potentially recur. So my strategy is generally that if someone is absent from work, it should result in something. Now, that something isn't a threat. It's not a negative reaction to somebody being off. But as a minimum, my suggestion would be a return to work meeting every time somebody is absent from work. It gives us an opportunity to check in and see how they are, see what they've actually been off with and why they weren't able to work. It's a means of informally reviewing attendance levels. So if this is something that happens 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year, but fairly well spaced out, and we've got a bit of kind of corporate memory loss that we forget that this is someone who's perhaps been off before, we can connect those dots a little bit more. But also that individual knows that the issue isn't just going to be ignored and that nobody misses them. So if somebody, when they wake up and thinks, actually today I just can't be bothered, they're more likely to come in than pull a sickie because they know that that absence is going to be addressed with them in some way or another. So when do we have the triggers then for formal action? So what we were talking about on this previous slide is absences that aren't really an issue. So they've got some genuine sickness absence. We're not always talking about people pulling sickies here, but it's just making sure that we're completing that administration and that we are acknowledging when somebody has been off. But when does that tip over then into the formal trigger for action to take place? Well, the answer here is in your policy. So hopefully you have a sickness policy that is detailed enough that it contains triggers for when formal action will need to be started if somebody has been off sick for a period of time. If your policy doesn't have that in, then you may take the view that actually it gives you the ability to be quite fluid with it, but that does make consistency quite difficult. So if your policy doesn't already have this, it's something that I'd suggest that you review. And if you don't have a sickness absence policy, then there will be one that we're going to be sharing with you after the session. So you can choose what your triggers may be. So it could be that, for example, you say something like if you're off for 7 days in total or more than 3 occasions. So 3 instances of being off. Now that's nothing set in stone. That's just me throwing figures out onto the screen to give you an example. Or you could use the Bradford factor. So the Bradford factor is something that we're going to come on to in a bit more detail in the next slide. And it's a formula that can be used to produce a sickness score that you can then use to assign triggers to. And you could include in your policy that if someone is absent in response to a grievance being raised against them or a disciplinary being brought against them, that will result in an absence being formally reviewed. So it doesn't mean that they're going to be disciplined for that absence. It doesn't mean there's necessarily going to be a negative outcome. But what it gives the message of is if your absence is perceived to be in response to management behaviour of a formal process, that absence will result in a meeting to discuss how you are and what it is that's triggered it. Now, A-class doesn't set out any minimum triggers here. We just need to make sure that we are reasonable. So it's that favourite word of mine, favourite word of employment lawyers generally, that we need to be reasonable in how we set these triggers and how we respond. So the Bradford factor, this is where we take the number of absences, we time that number by itself, and then we multiply it by the number of days that the person has been off. And then a number is produced and we judge it against a range. So I'm going to show you a worked example of this, and we're going to cross our fingers that this works because we've had issues with the tech before. So what you'll see on the screen now, Dawn, is that visible? Yeah, perfect. So what you'll see on the screen now is the dashboard for the Hero system. And this is going to show you, so we're going to manage my absences here. So we're going into the absence tab and selecting calculators. And you'll see that we're going to select from our multitude of calculators, the Bradford factor. And what I'm going to complete in here is a number of absences, the total number of days that someone has been absent across those instances. And it will give a Bradford factor score. So as you can see here, that's 686. This is something that we'd consider some sort of formal action against somebody because that's quite high up there. And at the bottom there, you can see that we've got a little explanatory guide. So on the screen, you can see those numbers are changing. So 3 absences on 3 occurrences, that brings that score right down to where we might have some concern, or 1 absence for a total of 3 days, Bradford factor score of 3. We're not really concerned about that, but as that number starts to climb, then we can see that we've got those triggers on the screen that are going to give us a guide as to when we then might need to start taking formal sickness absence measures. So back to the presentation. So the choice over whether to use the Bradford factor or triggers is a matter for you. So if your business decides that they want to use the more simplistic, as we've got on the screen here, 7 days total absence or more than 3 occasions, or whatever figures that you want to set, you are absolutely free to do so. If you wish to use the Bradford factor, you can as well. That is a matter for you. Now, my next tip is we need to make sure that we are categorizing absence correctly. So if we've got someone who calls in sick because they say they have no childcare, that isn't sickness absence. They're absence because of a parental reason. Perhaps they need dependent leave or they need some other type of leave. It might be that you actually have the provision of leave for childcare within your business. But we need to be making sure that when somebody calls in and says that they are sick, they're taking a sick day, that it is because of their own health. Now, this is so that we have got the flexibility to manage those issues separately. Because if you have someone who is consistently off because they are looking after an elderly relative, because their childminder lets them down, or because their partner can't do the school run and they've got to do it today, that is a different issue compared to somebody who is off because of their own health. And we would want to manage those potentially separately. So you need to make sure, again, back to your policy, that we are dealing with these issues separately and that we are categorizing the reason why people are off in the correct manner. And this is something that I see a lot, is when I'm dealing with absence issues, either with a HR consultant, HR team, or a management team, is that they will give me a list of absences and say, right, we want to start formal absence management. Can you support us with that? And I'll be picking out 5 or 6 absences from that list that are not actually because of ill health. So it is important that we separate the two so that then we're not getting ourselves into a bit of a mess when we get into that process and we're telling someone, look, we need to have a discussion about your health because you're off all the time. And they say, well, actually, my health isn't an issue. I've got life issues going on that I could do with some support for. So we've got another poll there now on the screen. So how does your organisation typically approach managing employees with repetitive short-term absences? Do you do regular one-to-one meetings and informal check-ins? Do you implement formal attendance reviews and policies? Are you involving occupational health early on, or are you developing flexible or hybrid work options so that it sort of reduces the impact on your business? So we're seeing really, really strongly there, regular one-to-ones and informal check-ins. That's good. Yeah, really, really strong on that one. So taking that, and actually, it's good to see that we've got 60% falling into that first category. It sort of leads us very nicely onto our next point, which is welfare meetings. Now, I'm a big fan of these, particularly where we've either got people who are off repetitively with the same issue, or where we've got someone off on a long-term absence. So what we're doing here is we are checking in on welfare. This is not us formally managing that absence. So in these meetings, we would be seeing how they are. We potentially update them on work news if they're happy to receive it. So we need to communicate, what people are comfortable talking about in these meetings, asking if there's anything required to support them, always making sure that we take notes and store evidence of these meetings as well, that we schedule them regularly for people who are on longer term absence, and that we do make them optional from the employee standpoint. Because a regular criticism that I see of businesses is where we have someone who says, I was off for months and nobody cared until I was taken through a formal absence management process. So I'm really, really pleased that in this poll that we've seen that we're having regular one-to-one meetings and informal check-ins, even with short-term absences, because it's really, really good practice. And it means then it's going to stand you in good stead with those longer term absences for you to be in the habit of holding these meetings. Now, if an employee doesn't want to be bothered and they say, no, I don't want to be doing these welfare meetings, I want to be left alone, we would be asking them to confirm that in an email so that we have got it in writing and we've got it stored, so that if they change their mind later on and they try and criticize the business, we've got that evidence. But I would also be diarising perhaps for every 2 or 3 months, just say, look, appreciate you've said you don't want these meetings, just checking your position hasn't changed. There's no pressure from the business, but we do just want to check in on your welfare. Now, return to work meetings. These, again, as I've already said, are something that we need to be in the habit of doing, even for the shortest or most occasional of absences. It's really, really important that we understand why people were off, if they're actually well enough to return to work. Because that's something that we see sometimes where people either have exhausted company sick pay or their SSP is running out, and for financial reasons, they're trying to return to work when they're not well enough. And what that situation then generates is either an employee who's going to burn out, an employee who's then potentially going to get more ill, or there's going to be capability issues with their actual work because they're not well enough to be there. Has something happened at work that caused them to be off in the first place? So has there been a workplace injury that we need to be speaking to our insurance company about? Is there anything else that we need to be aware of? So it's really, really important that we show that, one, that all absence is noticed, so people are less likely to pull a sickie if they're having to explain themselves, but also that we are capturing information that can potentially inform us of any issues that we might not have been aware of. So I'm going to show you on the screen now just how this can be captured by way of examples. So we'll see as we're going into the system, we're going to select a staff member and back to the absence tab. And what we have here is the ability to view a sickness absence. So this is a return to work form that's already been completed, very sort of Blue Peter style. And then we've got one here, so at the bottom there, a return to work form that actually needs to be filled in. So the sorts of things that we would be asking in there is, how long somebody's been off for, if there's any issues that they want to make the company aware of. The ability to generate these is by putting in a new sickness absence here. So we can see for this employee, we're entering the absence and we're saying that it's ongoing and that a return to work form is required. So it's within the power of the person who's completing this from the company perspective to say, when this person comes back, I want that return to work form completed. When you go back into the record, you can then see the ability to commence an absence matter. So we can see here we've got the Bradford factor score for this individual, and obviously because this is a tester system, you can see the number of warnings that this individual has as well. At the bottom of the screen then you can see there's the ability to invite an employee to an absence review meeting. So this would put a date in their diary for them to sit down formally and to discuss their absence in the workplace with whoever is either setting the meeting or whoever's been elected to chair that meeting. So we can put the trigger information in there when we want them to notify that they're going to be attending, and then confirm that, so that goes into their diary. And then we've got the ability here to apply warnings. We can include the absences or the instances that we want to discuss with them. We can decide that we're not going to issue a sanction or actually issue a written warning in this instance because of the level of absence that this person has triggered. So you can see how just in a few clicks, we can make sure that, one, we're capturing all the information, that we are proactively managing the absence of this person who clearly from the screen is off all the time, and that we can maintain regular review meetings and also record our notes as well from them. So it can be, particularly where you've got someone who's off with lots and lots of absences, you can end up with a huge stack of administration to get through. So what's really, really key about the system that we've designed is all of this can be held within one section. And you can see here there's also the provision to add medical notes in there as well, and that those are all stored in line with a sensitive category of personal data under GDPR as well. So everything for that employee is contained within their own dashboard. So that's the review meetings, the return to work meetings, their medical information, their Bradford factor score, everything that you would need to manage that sickness absence in a compliant way. So back to where we were in terms of return to work. So when we've got recurring short-term absence, that could be something like Mondayitis. It could be somebody who's in and out, they struggle, and we struggle to know when they're reliably going to be in. There could be lots of varied reasons: headache, tummy bug, stress, the typical stuff that we see, or it could be the same issue on repeat. Now, what's really, really important is that we still get them to do their self-certification if they're only off for a day or two. Now, where we've got people who are off for short absences, but on many, many occasions, they are likely to ramp up their triggers. So this is something that you're probably going to have to get to grips with very quickly if it's something that's becoming an issue with a particular individual. So making sure that we're really, really organized with tracking when someone has been off, making sure that we can confidently say that we know when they've been off, what with, and that those self-certifications and the return to works have all been done. Now, with long-term absence, you need to think about, well, actually, what are we calling long-term here? And again, the clue is that it should be in your policy. So generally, this is when someone is off for more than 4 weeks, which is what ACAS recommends as the definition. And what this can potentially produce is that work-related stress cycle. So if you have someone who goes off with work-related stress, the longer that they are off and outside of the workplace, the thought of returning to work can then make them feel more stressed, and that absence is more likely to become prolonged. So you can end up in instances where sick notes can stretch for many months. So can go past sort of the typical month that we often see, the week or the month, and it can go to 3, 6, even potentially 9 months. So another poll on the screen for you here. So what practices does your organisation have in place to support employees returning from long-term sickness absence? So structured return to work plans with phased reintegration, mental health and wellbeing support programs, adjusted workloads and temporary role modifications, or regular follow-ups with HR and line managers. So seeing a bit of a split there. So restructured return to work, I'm going to like that one. And mental health and wellbeing support. So yeah, we have got a response there as well, and adjusted workloads. And then we've got a good chunk as well with regular follow-ups with HR. So really, really good. The GP with long-term sickness absence is not your friend. Hopefully this doesn't come as a surprise to many of you. There's an article on the screen from the Daily Mail where we've got a journalist who says they were able to secure 2 sick notes for stress in under 2 hours without ever speaking to a doctor, and all they had to do was pay £25 to fill out an online form. So if you ask someone to go to their GP to get a fit note to prove their absence, that's great. They've complied procedurally with what you want. But actually, that fit note is very, very rarely ever going to tell you anything valuable other than a start date and an end date for the note. And even where the GP has ticked to say that this isn't an individual that I need to review or see again, ultimately that is meaningless. I'm actually dealing with a situation at the moment where we've got someone who's been off for 8 months, and every single fit note that has been supplied for every single month has had the tick to say, I don't need to see this person again. So when a fit note becomes meaningless, what do we do? Well, do read it. So still have a look to see what somebody's off with, because we are expected to respond to the detail that's in there. So if we've got somebody who's off with work-related stress, we need to make sure that we are providing supportive measures, that we are considering reasonable adjustments, that we are looking at the welfare of that individual. Ultimately, there is a total lack of accountability from GPs on the issue of fit notes, but we do still need to ensure that they are provided. But what we need to remember is that the GP is not an expert in occupational health. Now, the role of occupational health is something that can be quite powerful. So these are people who are specialists in respect of health and someone's ability in the context of their role. So if you ask a GP, is this person fit to undertake their role? Are they fit to come back to this job? A GP may often say, I'm not an occupational health specialist. This isn't a question that I can answer. So occupational health can provide advice on adjustments, potentially on recovery timescales, what support that individual might need, and they can go toe-to-toe with a GP on an opinion. They are medical professionals, and there are grades that you can instruct. So it could be that you send someone to a nurse, a doctor, or a specialist. So we can ask for a full report from occupational health, and we can give that more weight than the GP if it's reasonable to do so. They're also company appointed, and it's really important that we are asking key questions, that we don't just send somebody off for an occupational health report, that we are sending the job description, that we're sending any medical information that we've got, and that we are asking, are there any reasonable adjustments that can be put in place for this individual? Would a phased return help? Is there anything that the company needs to be aware when we're looking at the return of this individual? So it could be that we ask, and typically when I'm drafting these for clients, sometimes there's 20, 30, 40 questions that we are pushing to occupational health to get then a really specific and bespoke report back in relation to that employee's health. So then when is it reasonable to dismiss? So what's key is that we must try and manage the absence first. So we've got to go through a process and establish whether a return is likely and how long that could be. We're not going to establish that in just one meeting, and we're going to come onto in a moment the process that we should be following. We are expected to sit it out. A capability, so because of sickness, absence, because of health, these are never quick dismissals. We've got to do all that we can to establish how we can support someone to return. Are there any adjustments that we can make? Have we looked after that person's welfare? And have we waited as long as is reasonably possible before we make that decision to dismiss? It's difficult as well. So if we've got somebody who says, well, look, I'm ill, what is it that you expect me to do? You're taking me through a formal process, you're issuing me with warnings. I can't help the fact that my health is poor. This can be quite a stressful situation for HR, for managers to administer, and also for the person that's going through it. So it's really, really important that we remember that this isn't a disciplinary process. This is us dealing with somebody because potentially they are too poorly to undertake the job that they've been employed to do. So it's important that we do have some empathy when we're going through this process. So starting point, what does the law say? So when we want to dismiss somebody, it's for the employer to show that we have a fair reason to dismiss. So hopefully the 5 fair reasons aren't entirely lost on everybody. So we've got conduct when somebody has done something wrong, redundancy when their role no longer exists, SOSR, so some other substantial reason, statutory reasons, which we come across very rarely, and then highlighted on the screens where it relates to the capability of the employee for performing work of the kind which he was employed to do. So we're going to select that reason because we're talking about sickness absence. We're concerned that there is a capability reason why we might need to dismiss somebody. Now, we need to ensure, once we've selected our potentially fair reason, that we then move on to part 2 of the unfair dismissal test, which is determining whether we are being fair. So the test here is it will depend on whether in the circumstances the employer has acted reasonably or unreasonably in treating the reason that we have selected as a sufficient reason for dismissing the employee. And that shall be determined in accordance with the equity and substantial merits of the case. Now, what this means is that if we have selected capability as a potentially fair reason to dismiss someone, that we have acted reasonably in believing that it was sufficient to dismiss someone for that reason. So what does that mean? So 1, we have to act reasonably. 2, we have to be clear we've got sufficient reason for dismissal, that we believe this person is no longer capable of undertaking their role and they're unlikely to be for potentially a considerable period of time. That it's fair in consideration of the merits of the case, considering the employer's size and resources. And then we need to think, well, who decides what is reasonable? Well, a judge, unfortunately, but hopefully we don't want to get to that point. So we've then got the range of reasonable responses test. So have we explored all alternatives? Do we know the prognosis and timescales? Can we explain with credibility why we can't wait any longer? Would reasonable adjustments change anything? So have we followed a process to uncover all of those points? Have there been warnings so an employee knows that if their absence continues, if their attendance doesn't improve, that there is a potential that they could end up in a capability hearing? Has the employee been engaged in the process and the decision making? Have they had the chance to have their say? And I always say that if we have somebody in a meeting that could potentially result in a capability dismissal, it should not come as a surprise to that employee. They should have been through a relatively long process with staged outcomes where they are being warned that potentially their end of their employment could be on the horizon if the situation doesn't improve. So the process, we need regular meetings that don't stop. So those welfare review meetings, unless an employee has opted out of them, regular welfare reviews to check in on how somebody is doing. And that's super important when we're going through a formal process as well, that we are mindful of someone's welfare during that formal process, and that where we've got those intermittent absences, that we do ensure that we do those return to works. We start with an informal review when it starts to become an issue. So This is where absence is starting to become a problem. If it's long-term or recurring, it might be that we consider getting some medical evidence at this stage so that we understand what the employee is suffering with. We understand whether the sickness is going to continue to be long-term or whether they're going to continue to be in and out. So we know what it is that we're dealing with, and that potentially we could even look at an early occupational health referral so that we can start to understand whether any adjustments or support can make a difference. Stage 1 then, so we're moving on to the formal stages now. So this is where the employee is going to be aware that their absence is becoming an issue. And if a warning's issued at this stage, it's going to be, look, this is a stage 1 or a written warning where we need you to make an effort to improve your attendance or to be coming back to work soon. Stage 2, so if their attendances continue to be a problem, or if they don't come back, if they're continuing to be off, this absence is now a serious issue. And if we don't see an improvement, your employment could be at risk. So we're in that sort of final written warning potential territory. And then stage 3, consideration whether termination is appropriate, and remembering termination for capability is always with notice. So it could be we add some stages into this process, particularly where we've got someone dealing with a disability. We might want to add some additional stages. I would never be taking stages away though. So we've got a couple of queries here, which I'm just going to touch on here. So where do we stand with repeated absences relating to menstrual health? So if we're talking about someone who's off, potentially they have quite difficult menstrual cycle, or perhaps, you know, they're struggling with their periods, then obviously that is going to mean that we are having regular absences. And I will be treating that almost like we would with somebody with a disability. So I will be treating them as though they've got protected characteristics. So potentially stretching those triggers out, giving them additional time before we start a formal process, or adding in some additional stages. In terms of, does a similar process apply when an employee is willing to come back to work but unwilling to undertake fundamental parts of their role? So again, this would fall potentially then into a performance review when they're back. So yeah, they're well enough to be at work, but if they're then not prepared to undertake the full elements of their role, that would still fall into a capability process. But Hayley, that does sound a little bit complicated. So if you want to pick that up with me afterwards, I'm happy to have a chat with you. And then there's some further questions coming, so I will pick those up further towards the end just to make sure we don't run out of time. And as always, if we don't have time to get to them, I will give you some responses by email as well. So stages, as we've said, we can always add more stages, but we don't advise removing them. Consider time between the stages. So the shorter the period, so if you go from stage 1 to stage 2 in a week and a half, that's going to be much higher risk. So we need to make sure we're giving a reasonable amount of time to allow for improvement. So allow for medication to take effect, for health to get better, for treatment to sort of, you know, start to make a difference, or potentially to wait for a medical opinion. Now, I did deal with a case where a medical opinion was going to be a year away because this person was caught up in the NHS waiting list. Now, this person had already been off for a year. They weren't going to get an opinion for another year, and we did move to dismiss in this situation. And thankfully, it didn't result in a tribunal claim. But when we've looked at precedent for this sort of thing, again, it's going to come down to how reasonable it is for your business to wait, taking into account things like size and resources. So if you're in a situation where the medical process is holding things up, that is definitely something that you might want to take advice on, and make sure that you are getting a legal opinion if you're not sure if there's something that you should be waiting for or not. If we're seen to be jumping the gun, then what I would say is it's likely to potentially be seen to be unreasonable. So if we're motoring through the stages, if we're not slowing down where an occupational health or a doctor has said that actually there's a treatment that might make a difference and mean that someone could come back within a few months, it's really, really important that we are seen to be taking reasonable action and that we're not just rushing somebody out the door. So meetings and documentation, it's really, really important that we make sure our invitations are compliant. So ensuring that, particularly where termination's on the table, right to be accompanied, evidence in advance, we're warning of potential outcomes, we're using a supportive tone, and that we are encouraging participation. At meetings, ensure the employee is heard. let them air their views, and that you are considering them, and ask them to be proactive with their own evidence as well. And think about, well, what can we do to help support your recovery? Make sure we're asking those proactive questions. And when we're coming to outcomes, make sure that we have reasons and rationale, and that we are explaining ourselves, that we are setting out what the next steps are, what the agreed actions are, and that we are giving people the right to appeal. If someone refuses to attend meetings, allow a postponement or two, offer them the chance to bring support with them. So that could be in the form of a family member. If we think they're trying to sneak a solicitor in, top tip of mine is to check the role of solicitors. You can check that online, and veto someone before you've confirmed that it's acceptable for them to bring them in. Consider other mechanisms as well. So we can offer to meet in a neutral place. We can offer virtual means. Don't do what I think, is it Tesla? I'm not sure. I think it might have been where they were sending managers in Germany just to turn up at people's houses. We don't do that. Always make sure it's agreed in advance. If all else fails and we can't get someone in a meeting, we've allowed postponements, we've offered adjustments, we've offered support, then request submissions in writing, so that at least we've tried to get their view on matters before we then come to a decision. If they raise a grievance, my suggestion is always to consider whether we either treat this as an appeal, or whether actually it's higher risk to reject the grievance. It is a high risk maneuver to reject a grievance. So to insulate your business risk, I'd suggest you deal with it. It's better to flush issues out and actually address the grievance. It's probably not going to be a long or detailed process, because it's going to relate to the matter that you're already dealing with. And it could be that actually you've inadvertently breached your own policy, or you've missed a step, and it flags it to you and gives you the chance to rectify it before we get to the end of a process. This doesn't mean either that you have to entirely stop a process. You can consider whether it's reasonable to run them side by side, but just to brush it to one side, it could make it look like the employee is being railroaded. So again, back to that, is this going to look reasonable to an outsider before you make those decisions? And as always, if you're not sure, always make sure that you take advice if you feel that risk is being ramped up. So if you've got someone who fails to cooperate, they won't release medical records, they won't attend occupational health, they won't answer questions or attend meetings, I would always warn in writing first that it's in their best interest to cooperate, and why. So explain, look, I'm going to be making decisions based on the evidence that I have available to me. So it is in your interest to give me information so that I can take it into account. But ultimately, without medical information, discussions on adjustments or support or the counter view from the employee, we're not going to have those. And it will mean that potentially we're making a decision in isolation over whether an employee can fulfill their contract or not. But if it's because an employee hasn't cooperated and we have to make a decision that ends up with someone's employment being ended, then an employment tribunal isn't going to judge you for having your hands tied behind your back. But it is really important that we tell them why we need this information. It's in your best interest to cooperate. We need this information so that we can take it into account before we make those decisions. So discrimination, again, we're just going to touch on this really lightly. You'll notice that throughout this session, I have referred to making reasonable adjustments and extending processes. Now, my view is that if you've got someone who's off on long-term sickness absence, you treat them as if they are a disabled person, because what you don't want is to take a punt, essentially, and shorten the process and then get to tribunal and a judge tell you that someone was actually disabled and that in hindsight you should have done things differently. So by being reasonable about these matters, by looking at adjustments for everybody, by considering welfare, and by extending processes, one, we are putting an employee who is ill at the center of this process and making sure that we're dealing with things in a sensitive and empathetic way, but it also means that we're going to be reducing our legal risk. So for those who aren't sure, the definition of disability in the employment world, it's not the blue badge, it's not the PIP test, it's our very own definition, which is where someone has a mental or physical impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on someone's ability to undertake normal day-to-day activities and their work activities. So as I said, take the view in-house to treat long-term or regularly recurring absences like a disability, and then argue the point in tribunal, not in capability meetings over the definition. Always consider the offer of reasonable adjustments, have regular welfare and return to work meetings, consider those occupational health referrals, and consider adding steps to the process. It's better to be safe than sorry. It's better to add a couple of steps into the process than spend 2 years and potentially 30, 40 grand in tribunal. trust me, it's a better investment in your time just to take a bit more time with these management processes. There's many cases where employers haven't treated something as a disability, and then they've really been stung when they've gone to tribunal. If this is something that's concerning you, if you have got in the back of your mind now, you know, a little voice that's saying, oh, there's some risk here, there's a call to action at the top of the screen. You can book a meeting directly with us and we can talk you through the situation and give you any more advice on it. So we are going to go through managing disability discrimination in another session because it is a huge topic, so look out for that as well. So what's in your policy? Key points that you should have in there: triggers, about reasonable contact, reasonable expectations on compliance with policy. That formally you will review absences when it's in response to a disciplinary or grievance. Explain why absence is actually managed, so why we go through this process when someone isn't well, and the distinction between sickness and other absences. So just super quickly, if you don't have a sickness absence policy, if you're worried that yours isn't up to date, then if you're someone who has got the benefit of our system, then the policies are all built in there. So you can see on the screen now, I'm going to show you the sickness absence policy that is in our list and what it covers. So your responsibility as an employee, sickness absence generally, we cover sick pay, we cover holidays during sickness, return to work, medical suspension, attendance management, everything that you could possibly need, reasonable adjustments, substance misuse, it's all covered in there. Now, the system's great because what it means is when we update a policy, we can see when it's been read, as we can see there on the screen. Employees have got the ability to download and view them, and we've got that nice audit trail of when someone has read a policy, so that before we go launching into a procedure, we can check with that specific employee to make sure they've read the policy, and if not, that we can then attach it with any letters that we send to them. As we said, we're going to be circulating a free policy afterwards anyway, and also as a nice bit of bonus content, my summary on the Employment Rights Bill and everything that you need to know in a nice shiny brochure, so that and I think we're setting out a page per provision, so nice and easy to digest as well. If you need any more advice, then please don't hesitate to reach out and book a meeting with us. We've also got our podcast, which is just getting more and more popular. We're really pleased to be in the top 20 HR podcasts, where we talk about real life examples that I have dealt with and advised upon. And I think the one that dropped today, is it the naked Christmas one? Yeah, an employee who got naked at a Christmas party and told I think it was the CEO, to F off. So if you want to see how we dealt with that one, please don't hesitate to check out the popular podcast channels. If you want to keep your business compliant, don't hesitate to reach out for a free consultation or a demo of our system. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending. I'm just going to come on to these last questions now before we run out of time. So following process while an employee's on long-term sickness absence. So yes, the process that I touched on the slides, that is something that you would follow for long-term sickness. We have someone that has mental health and alcohol-related issues with regular absences, and a GP's report is linked to 2 issues. So the mental health aspect there potentially could be a disability. Alcohol issues are not disability related. However, simply because someone has alcohol related issues doesn't mean that you can't actually manage sickness absence and ultimately potentially dismiss someone if they reach the appropriate triggers and they've been warned. So as a business, what I would be suggesting is that we are proactively pointing them at potential resources that they can use, but it also might be that you take a view on testing in case someone is turning up for work and they're not fit to be at work. So there's loads of stuff to unpick there. So if that is something that you want us to go through in more detail with you, I'd be happy to do so. And actually, I'm dealing with something similar for another 3 or 4 businesses at the moment around drugs, which is a real kind of trend at the moment. So happy to pick that up with you if needed. Repeated absences due to morning sickness. So if it's pregnancy related, stay away from it. Definitely take legal advice. So pregnancy related absences are gold plated protected. So be really careful before you go anywhere near that. I would definitely take legal advice on that one, Anthony. And what can we do if someone has advised us that they're off due to poor mental health but hasn't provided a fit note, bearing in mind their fragility? So if someone's ill, they still need to be complying with your processes. So we can write to them in a supportive way, but ultimately we would be expecting them to be liaising with them with a medical professional if they're off and they are so fragile that they would be in touch with their GP. So we would be insisting that they do comply with the policies. Again, it might be that we stretch the triggers, that we allow them a bit more time to comply, but that is something that ultimately you would want that person to be in a structured process so that situation doesn't run away from you. I hope this has been a helpful session for everybody. That's all we've got time for today. We have packed loads in today. So the slides will be circulated. The bonus content will be coming out over the course of this week. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to reach out to me privately, please don't hesitate to do so. So you can contact me through the website, or if you book consultation or demo, you can ask for me if you've got a burning issue that you need some help with. Please look out for details on the next webcast. Dawn, what's the next one on? Fair versus unfair dismissal. Yeah. So the next one's fair versus unfair dismissal. We're going to be doing a deep dive into conduct dismissals next. And if there's any particular topics that you would like us to deal with, please don't hesitate to reach out on our social media. But thank you so much. That's all we've got time for. And that is the end of the session.